Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming and Dark Ages Vampire, the recaps, part 4 of Power or Mercy. My chronicles always have shocking names, I really must do something about that. Anyhow, the players were making their voyage to Ely, down, or up rather, the river Great Ouse, towards Bishop's Lynn, where they would hopefully manage to secure a boat to take them to Lindisfarne and the location of Matthias, the Salubri that dwells there, as that is part of their mission. Ely is a very important town at this point in history, and the reason for this is because Ely, which is on the east coast, is landlocked, but it's on the eastern side of England, is not only on a very important river, but also houses Ely Cathedral. And Ely Cathedral, this octagonal-shaped building, houses the Bishop William Longchamp. And why is William Longchamp important? Is because he is the regent to the throne of England and parts of France, in the absence of Richard the Lionheart, who's off killing Saracens and dying of dysentery. So, it's quite important for that reason. It's also quite important because of trade. When Danes come to England in order to trade, they often don't go down as far south as London. That's where French traders and other such traders, Jutes and Belgians, decide to apply their wares. No, rather the Danes will make their way to Bishop's Lynn and the River Great Ouse, and they'll quite often deposit their goods in Ely, which has become a bustling market town, as has St Ives, in fact, for the same reason. St Ives is in Norfolk rather than St Ives on the south. So, Ely is a very important place. Faith is prevalent there, also because Crusaders who are coming back from the Crusades by boat, as you would if you had to get back to England, really, it's a bit of a long walk underwater. If they were travelling to the north or East Anglia, not that East Anglia strictly exists, but bear with me, they would quite often come down the River Great Ouse and find themselves deposited in Ely. What this means is there's not only a lot of crusaders, there's also a lot of priests, there's also a lot of foreigners, because one of the main forms of income during the Crusades was ransom. While people were off fighting, no one was really tilling the land, and while the land was so poor because of the constant rainfall at this point in history, there's also no crops, there's no tax, there is no form of income for, well, lords, barons and the like. And what that means is most crusaders, when they're going out to supposedly liberate the Holy Land, are in fact kidnapping French nobles or Frankish nobles, German nobles, Papal State nobles, and so on, Byzantine nobles, and ransoming them back to their families. So people come from England, make the journey halfway there, kidnap a German, go back, ransom them, and that is a legitimate form of income at this time in history. This is all true, by the way. And this isn't just going on from English crusaders, everyone is doing it. It's frankly one of the most ridiculous aspects of the Crusades, that most crusaders were just going over there to kidnap people rather than kill Saracens, or at least most of the nobles that were involved in such. And so it's quite a multicultural town at this point, which is bizarre for somewhere in East Anglia, if I'm honest, because I've lived in Norwich, and that is not multicultural now. But Ely, yes. The coterie have arrived, and noticing what a busy hub of commerce and people that it is, and noticing the practically evangelical preachers in their pulpits on the side of the river, in the town, raining down hot hail and fire and brimstone, the people in gibbets, in stocks, in pillories for various crimes, the Saracens being led around with chains around their necks to be used as slaves or novelties in various courtrooms. It's somewhat of an intimidating place, even for powerful Cainites, because there is an undercurrent of faith. A lot of these people who have gone out to Europe and then the Holy Land have gone out with some measure of faith, and they've come back with some measure of faith. And that's because faith is a very charged thing right now. William Longchamp, being the regent, is, Thomas Becket aside, one of the most important religious figures in English history, because under him and through his successors, there you started to see a priest in every town, a friar on every road, the size of convents increasing, churches being built where churches were not before, because the church as controlled by the Pope, was getting its fingers into all of Europe around this time in a way that has taken a very long time to pry the fingers free from. And this is when the church was really becoming quite a power player next to the hereditary nobility. So, second sons of nobles would become priests. Injured knights would become priests. Second daughters would become nuns. And so on. You would find this more and more in the coming decades, especially while the Crusades were still ongoing. So the coterie disembarked from their boat. They left their mortal retinue, the majority at any rate, in the boat, in the middle of the river, because it was log-jammed with traders anyway, and it, of course it was night time, taking with them only David, Lady Cheyenne's manservant, and not sycophantic, but certainly ever so loyal ghoul, and Tom the Goat, or Tom the Rapist, as he's otherwise known, who is in the service to Sylvanus Brents. Sylvanus was most keen to explore this church on a bridge that Claudia San Giovanni had told him about, that was apparently safe haven for all of the Cainites any Cainites passing through Ely. However, when Sylvanus and Tom the Goat observed it, they noticed no one was really paying any attention. They would be walking straight past this church on the bridge. The church, a strange square structure, had a tower rather than a steeple, or rather spire. Everyone would just pass it and pay it no heed. No one would be observing it. And it took them a while to notice this, but it's almost like it's hidden in plain sight. For some reason no one else seems to be aware of it. Very odd, they thought. Meanwhile, Lord Hyle and Lady Cheyenne decided to introduce themselves to the one of the Cainites they did know of in Ely, Daniel the Magister. Daniel being the brother in blood to Lord Hyle, shares the same sire. Antoninus the Fertile of Clan Lasombra. And Daniel allowed them to stay in his small sort of chantry, a place wreathed in blackness, of course, ensconced candles, very dark, very low flickering lights that Lasombra do not like light, and he has a bunch of friars in his employ. He styles himself in something of a religious fashion, has a cross around his neck, and quite a small man, but wears heavy cloaks and has a short cropped beard, very tidy looking. Daniel the Magister, who is actually from Byzantium, had made a pilgrimage, by way of backstory, to England in order to actually find Glastonbury Tor, and was embraced around there, never left England after that point. And Mithras' edict that there can only be 4 Lasombra in the baronies of Avalon at any one time basically applies to Daniel, Hyle's child, who's dead because of what happened in the first session, Daniel's child, who is actually in Iberia, who is known as, do I have it on the tip of my tongue? I can't recall his name, but his nickname is the Hammer of the Moors. Not that he is a Moor, as in he hammers them. And currently there's a space for another one, because their sire is off, also in Iberia, the sort of seat of Clan Lasombra. And so Daniel welcomed them in, and he gave them a rundown of the local politics. Very glad was he to see his brother. No pretense, no duplicity. He was glad indeed to see his brother. They shared an embrace, the normal kind. And his brother also introduced him to the mortal nun that he's been dragging around with him, Ruth Mary, or Peter Ruth. Her nun name will matter less soon, I trust. Well, trust me. Lord Hyle has plans for this nun because he saw that she could wield a weapon while they were on the road. He saw that she had a bit of vim, a bit of fire, a bit of willpower, unlike the others who had been so cruelly broken with murmur of the false will, with repeated conditioning, and with vast amounts of blood bonding. These nuns have become blood dolls and ghouls who are sycophants and, well, liabilities in a social situation, but terrors when not. There was a bit of discussion what was going on between sessions, basically, and that was what was happening to the other nuns. And to a lesser extent, Eric the Boatman, who they've managed to also keep with them. And honest John, Honest John, the farmhand, and William the Roach, his simple brother. They've got a small entourage of incapables, but it's a nice little group. And so, yes, Daniel was quite intrigued as to why Lord Hyle was bringing this nun around with him, guessing at the reason. And, yes, told them about what was going on. And what was going on? Well, Aethelred, the Ventru, ancient Ventru, who kind of held seat in Ely, had recently had the communal Elysium with Magi and Lupines that actually occurs in Ely. He hasn't said where, interestingly, at least annually. For some reason, the three groups aren't at each other's throats in Ely, probably because of the high religious presence here. It would be too dangerous for them to do so. And shortly thereafter, Aethelred was brought down low outside of his small hill fort on the outside of Ely by a pack of lupines, and he's now in torpor, he's reliably informed, rather than has met final death. Interestingly, Alice Upland, his child, was there at the scene, as was Bethany the Heretic, as Daniel styles her, a salubri who makes her rest in the catacombs, somehow, of Ely Cathedral itself, which is no small thing given the true faith emanating from that place. Maybe it's not emanating downwards. So why did the Lupines spare Alice Upland? Why did they spare Bethany the Heretic? Why is she a heretic? Well, because she's a member of the Cainite heresy, and Daniel is a Catholic, bona fide Roman Catholic, whereas Bethany is a member of the Cainite heresy, believes that Cain is tantamount to God. Bear in mind, this is from Daniel's viewpoint, that the antediluvians are saints, and that vampires can be gods in their own by their own power, that humans should be forced to serve them. That he feels that she is a charlatan and should be brought down, and so, as we later found out, according to Bethany at any rate, he has written to the Tremere in order to actually highlight to them the presence of the salubri, which may of course put him and Lord Hyle at counter purposes, but we've yet to see how that will be resolved. Daniel has said that there's a power vacuum now, and in order to provide some stability to the region, without Aethelred, there needs to be some Cainite in charge, and while he does not actively seek rule, he would accept it if that is what the satraps, Lady Cheyenne and Lord Hyle, would impose upon him. He's a more spiritual man, he's more interested in the abyss, he's an occultist. If you imagine the stats on the sheet, he's largely obtenebration, and not much beyond that. Obtenebration, occult, and theology is his bailiwick. But here he says he doesn't actively seek rule. However, Alice Upland is completely incompetent for it. Bethany is a heretic and a salubri, and so he sees himself as the only real logical choice. And however, if Alice Upland was put in charge, he would not rebuke, or he would not rebel, and certainly if Bethany was, he probably would. He does not feel, because Alice Upland considers, in Daniel's opinion, that she should be the next lord just due to her being the child of Aethelred, but Daniel does not consider Alice Upland up to the task. She has no entourage, she has no fingers in mortal pies, whereas Daniel is quite pervasively involved in the church, and to a small extent he has his little coterie of friars around him. Coterie, not vampire coterie, but his coterie is comprised of the monastic types. His mortal entourage, yes. And so the coterie of vampires decided that they would go and visit Alice Upland. But before they did, Sylvanus Brents and Tom the Goat decided to explore this church a little more, a church that Lord Hyle was particularly reticent to look at. After being told that it was being ignored by everyone, he associated with some kind of mystical mumbo-jumbo and does not want to get involved, especially as when it was referred to Daniel, what is this church, why is everyone ignoring it, Daniel couldn't even remember it existed, which is odd, seeing as he's been in Ely for decades, if not longer. And so, Sylvanus Brent, his curiosity getting the better of him, entered the church and commanded Thomas the Goat to also come inside out of the rain, but keep an eye on the door and see whether anyone pays any attention to them. The church's interior was far from a normal church, more of a bizarre temple, almost cubic in shape, and no seats to behold, but strange rivulets of like drainage going around the outside of the room and leading in a sort of square, and so a square cut into four, with in the centre an altar which is twisted in a weird fashion. And Sylvanus was quite entranced by this, lighting a torch as he went. No, in fact he didn't light a torch, he just used his auspex because it was pitch black in there. No windows in this church, might I add. He was feeling along the walls. Carved into the walls were various sort of hermetic symbols, I suppose, various circles, squares, triangles, and the like, in various fashions that he didn't understand, but this was clearly a location used by occultists of some vein, and so thought immediately travelled to Magi or the Tremere. Except, why would the Tremere be here if there's a salubri here? Why would they stay here? Why would they construct a church? Or how old is this place? Sylvanus heard a strange gurgling. Didn't investigate it at first. Advanced, carried on going into the temple. Found a slight up-step, and upon that step he found a wider diorama of these symbols that, unfortunately, partly due to rolls and his understanding, just didn't understand. It's not his school of magic, and so he headed back to the door, where he noticed that Tom the Goat had disappeared, and entering the drainage, running through the drainage and up onto this twisted altar, was a frothy, pinkish reddish, almost luminescent blood that was gurgling its way down the drains and up onto this altar Sylvanus's automatic instinct was to scoop some of this up into a vial and examine it outside, and yes, it was almost orange, glowing orange. This didn't look like blood, it looks a bit like stage blood, but it looks alchemical, weird in some fashion. And despite all common sense to the contrary, he decided to re-enter the temple and see what was going on. What can I say? Sylvanus is an inquisitive Cappadocian. Maybe that's what will lead to the fall of the clan, perhaps. The blood on the altar was forming the face of Tom the Goat. And speaking from the lips of the face was not Tom the Goat's voice, but another voice entirely, this weird gurgling, deep voice, booming, that telling Sylvanus that this was the sanctum of House Flambeau, which he had heard of, and that... and demanding, why are you here? You have offered us a sacrifice. Sylvanus hadn't actually offered them Tom the Goat. They just sort of taken him, but he didn't object. So, why are you here? And Sylvanus basically said, we're looking for a safe place to stay. We noticed no one could see at this place, and we had been recommended this place by Claudia Sangiovanni. There was a pause, and the face answered, we will permit you to stay in this safe haven. No one will know you are here, including the faithful of Ely, but you will have to sacrifice something of yourself. This took Sylvanus back a little. He's already lacking one arm. He asked what? Organs. We require your stomach and your liver. Now, to be fair, Sylvanus wasn't using either of those things, and so he took them out. He performed a transplant, removed his organs, put them on an altar, not long after seized a passing beggar and basically amputated themselves, using his high skill at mortis to kind of perform a rudimentary job that is neither one thing or the other. It suffered aggravated damage for doing so, I think it was fair. And the altar consumed his organs. Now, what does it mean when a house of mages has the body parts, the organs of an undead denizen? We will have to find out in another session, but as soon as it consumed them, where the step goes up, there's a grill along the bottom of the step, this sort of brass work grill. And a bright flash of white light moved along this grill. It went no idea what that is, but it implied there was something beneath the temple. But Sylvanus was happy. This was a safe place to stay. A bit sad he'd lost Tom the goat, but he was a rapist. And interestingly, while they had been on the road, they had come across a friar who had told them that Ely was up ahead, asked them news of St. Ives and so on. And Sylvanus was all prepared to give the friar to Tom the goat to do with what he will, but Tom the goat declined, saying he never touches the clergy or any religious folk, and Sylvanus therefore let the friar go. The friar had actually was going to offer them some kind of arms until he saw that the Cappadocian was one-armed and looked like death. After all, he is a Cappadocian, and so he scurried off into the woods. Meanwhile, Hyle and Lady Cheyenne and Peter Ruth Marie had headed to the hill fort belonging to Alice Upland. When they got there, they noticed that this ruined, dilapidated castle, which the citizens of Ely no longer use because it's a walled town, and to be honest, it's about as safe as a town could be. Yes, this ruined castle was absolutely festooned with crows, with ravens going caw, looking down, watching closely everything that went on, the passage of these vampires moving into the hill fort and going in to the castle itself. And it would appear Alice Upland had no mortal servitors, but these ravens numbered possibly 100, watching, waiting. And it wasn't beyond Hyle to realise, well, she's supposed to be a Ventru. Ventru aren't usually gifted with animalism. They certainly don't usually have a huge propensity for birds watching in their stead. So he went into the courtroom of Alice Upland, who apparently had no mortal servitors, as I say, no ghouls. Sat on a rather shabby throne, shabby tapestries as well, threadbare, hanging on the walls. Straw on the ground had probably not been replaced and was rotting. A rather sallow-looking Ventru with a somewhat hawk-like face. That the bird connection isn't that. A rather sardonic kind of a woman actually sat at a table with them, asked for their introductions, and had already been told by Daniel that she requires an offering in order to accept her pleasure. And because Daniel somehow knew of her feeding preference, or claims to know, that she can only feed on virgins, which admittedly isn't that original, but I rolled for it, they brought one of the nuns from the boat, one of the ones who was completely gone in the head, hoping that this nun was a virgin. And so I suppose there is a way to check. Alice Upland meted with them, greeted with them, fed with them, in a sense, and wanted to know why they were there. They explained their mission in a limited degree. They didn't say that they were going. They said they were heading north, but they didn't say they were mediating between Tremere and Salubri. Alice Upland was quite respectful to them, and they were on common ground until it came to the point when Lord Hyle basically questioned her right to rule. And she said, I'm not ruling yet. I would require Mithras, or the Prince, or a Baron, of which there isn't one in Norwich, to appoint me as Lord of Ely, or even Baron of Norwich, or whatever. And by dint of my being child of Aethelred, I can at least act as regent until he awakens again. Lord Hyle was less convinced because, of course, it seemed like she had no power at her disposal, despite being quite an old Ventru, at least in generation, if not in literal age. The La Sombre Hyle went on to, basically ask of her credentials. And that's when she started getting quite sarcastic and quite sardonic and quite derisive. And, what right do you have? Well, I'm a satrap. Well, I know that, but you are in my domain right now. You are in my castle. You cannot speak to me rudely or I will cast you out. And it all became a bit of a Cold War standoff. And I can't say that Alice Upland really won Lord Hyle over. He was certainly favouring the idea of putting Daniel in place, although that would undoubtedly cause more friction than not, because, of course, Alice Upland, being a Ventru, may well have more friends in the baronies of Avalon than Daniel the La Sombre, when there's only 3 more. La Sombre, and Lord Hyle is one of them. Not that clan ties mean everything, but yes, Alice Upland is certainly more of a political beast than Daniel, for all intents and purposes anyway, just by dint of her being a Ventru. And so they headed out, evading the crow poo that was coming down upon them, and decided they would rest up. Over the course of the next week, they had sent a friar via Daniel to Bethany in the catacombs because only monks could really go down there, and if any vampire approached, the skin would be flayed from the bones. So, as they waited for a response, a week passed, a sort of week of downtime in which the coterie did things like forming bonds with their ghouls, teaching each other disciplines, or rather getting in the habit of it. They actually met up with one of Bethany's entourage. She actually has pilgrims that have flocked to her too. A gangrel and Nosferatu. The gangrel is Gunbjorn, and the Nosferatu is Holmstein, and Holmstein, a almost purple-skinned Nosferatu, frightfully thin, but coated with thick pulsing veins, as described by the Cappadocian, looking like a giant hemorrhoid, did meet them on Daniel's turf, and explained why Bethany would not just come out. You could be working for the Tremere for all we know. But they mediated well. There was no actual fracas between the two groups. And Tobias, the Nosferatu, who's been having something of a crisis of faith recently, definitely felt that he'd connected, I got the impression, with Holmstein and his talk of the Cainite heresy, or rather, as he called it, the Ashen priesthood, and the work of Bethany the prophet, or just the prophet, as in his mind Bethany is the prophet, not the heretic, of course, and eventually more Cainites will flock to her banner, and more will realise the truth of the Ashen priesthood, that Cain is God and that he will return to us. And Tobias, finding some succour at last from a member of his own clan, who, by the way, Holmstein found Tobias's opinion very disconcerting, given that he resembled nothing more than a gargoyle or grotesque, and Holmstein knows something of the Tremere's practices, being in the association of a salubri, and his being a Nosferatu, was a bit disconcerted by this supposed gargoyle, but became convinced that Tobias was just a young Nosferatu who didn't know much of anything about anything, and so he tried to take him under his wing to an extent. And a week passed. During this week, the La Sombre Heil did embrace his nun, who embraced her own mortal name. But prior to when she was a nun, she retook up the name of Coraline, and I do not have her surname, but Coraline. And so she has defrocked herself. She is no longer in the habit. And in fact, it became crucially obvious to the coterie that if they had kept their nuns in their habits, then news of what happened in Huntingdon would reach Ely eventually. In fact, it did reach Ely eventually. There was hot talk on the streets of the convent that had burned down the massacre that went on there, the dark figures in the night that perpetrated it, and the nuns that somehow escaped. So now there's a great hunt on for all of these escaped nuns. Those nuns that did escape are all in the employ of the vampires, and so they have all had their tongues cut out now. I'm not joking, they've had their tongues cut out now, and except for Catherine, the one that fell for Tobias, and is now a bit less falling for Tobias because she's seen his true form, but is hanging around with him because it's better, in her mind, to stick with this coterie of monsters than be returned to the convent, which was even worse. Heil is, of course, and has for the last week been going through various mental issues because he is now the home to 3 very angry spectres that were possessing the Mother Superior and have now moved into his body, and so he is finding sleep very restless and is having to spend at least 2 blood points to wake up every night. Various other things have gone on as well. Sylvanus has been very keen to meet the salubri woman, Bethany, because he's hoping that she, with her supposed healing arts, can somehow reattach his missing limb. And Heil is likewise hoping that the salubri will be able to drive out the evil spirits from his head. And so, yes, he embraced Coraline, and in the La Sombre fashion, La Sombre embrace is kind of a Nietzschean thing, or always a very cruel kind of embrace by tradition, whereas a Ventrue would probably hug a child quite close to him and say, "Behold my child next to my line, look at all the things he can do, look at how proud I am of him." The sombre embraces tend to be quite cruel, quite abusive, and there's almost a sense of abandonment after, there's almost a bit of bullying involved, simply so that when that child eventually plucks up the courage, grows the brass balls enough to approach their sire and say, "Why did you do this to me? Why were you so cruel to me in those early years?" the sire can say, "Look at the vampire I made you into with that cruelty. With such pride, at which point the La Sombra and his child can form quite a strong relationship, but you can perhaps see why all the La Sombra neonates rebelled against their elders in the Anarch Revolt, because they were just tired of being dicked around by their sires. Well, it became something of a quandary to Hyle and Daniel, because Daniel was involved in this ceremony as well, how to embrace Coraline in a sense that was going to be abusive and exert the sire's power over her. They thought about branding her with Hyle's initials, and by the way, Coraline is now played by a new player in the group. They thought of breaking all the bones in her hand and setting it badly before embracing her so that her left hand would be forever useless, which didn't really go in with the line of battle nuns. They thought of various ideas until the idea was come upon, well, let's use, I think, Murmur of the False Will. Not Murmur of the False Will. You know what. The Dominate discipline that allows you to remove memories from someone. Basically, remove all of her memories up until the time she was in the convent. Admittedly, she was taken by the convent at the age of 5. Lord Hyle has this power. And essentially, what he said to her is, I am going to do this to you. Any time prior to the convent, you will not be able to remember. You'll know that it's missing, and you'll know that it's me that removed those memories. So any happy times you had will be replaced by the misery that you suffered at the convent, followed by the embrace that I am now giving you. And you will realise that I am offering you a better life, a stronger life than you had before. And so that kind of torment was done to her. Her mind was wiped up to the age of 5. She forgot everything through various dramatic rule systems, and the embrace took place. A long and torturous embrace, by the way, not a swift drain of blood drop, a night-long, slow eking out of the blood until she had nothing left. This was not a pleasurable experience and wasn't supposed to be, because Lord Hyle likes to exert his dominance. He is, after all, a La Sombra on the road of kings. This was very much Lord Hyle's show, this session, if I dare say so, because when Bethany did arrive, with her Gangrel and her Nosferatu in tow, he kind of led the negotiations. Bethany essentially said that she should be in charge because she had the right course of it. She had the most powerful seat underneath the Cathedral of Ely, and she had an entire cult at her disposal. That none of the others had other vampires following them. That the Salubri need a bastion of safety in the Baronies of Avalon, and where better than Ely. That she had influence over the church, and she could exert that. And that she already had a formative alliance with Alice Upland. What does Daniel have? And so Hyle was somewhat split between what to do, and this scene went on for quite a long time. There was an excellent negotiation. I wish I had recorded it, because the truth of the matter is, as it occurred to Hyle, and Lady Cheyenne, because both of them were involved in making this decision, but the rest of the coterie kind of worked as advisors here, that while Daniel was probably the most rational person to put in charge, he also had the least amount of claim to it, because while he would potentially run a stable ship and already had his fingers in the monastic pie, he also had no allies here, no vampiric ones. Bethany had been in Ely longer than any other vampire. She is a Salubri elder, or an elder of the Salubri clan, and so she probably knows more about what goes on in Ely than anyone else. She also somehow survived an attack by werewolves, supposedly without a mark, which would imply a relationship with them too. Not only that, but against her, unfortunately, she belongs to the Cainite heresy, which Mithras does not look favourably upon at all. In fact, the large majority of civil discontent in Baronies of Avalon is from the Cainite heresy rather than from the Tremere. So there are things that work in her favour and things that work against her. Alice Upland, on the other hand, has the alliance with the Salubri, is the Ventru with presence there. Her sire, hereditary lineage and so on, and Arguably she could affect the military because of where her base is, and she could start making inroads into a lordship there. It was really quite difficult because at the same time Alice didn't come across as a terribly sympathetic character, but she did come across as a character that could throw her weight around and potentially her age around. She has raw power, while Daniel, surprisingly for a Sombra, has more subtle manipulations, and Bethany has the real power, but is a Salubri and would be painting an even bigger target on her head, and would perhaps be inviting Tremere aggressions if a Salubri lord or lady was appointed. So the coterie were at something of a loss of how to proceed. I'm sorry this video is going on so long, but hopefully it's interesting. They didn't know who to appoint, but they knew that in their roles of satraps, they had to appoint someone. Their role is to stabilise the baronies of Avalon, make sure that it stays stable at all times, and that meant that Ely did need a ruler, because if not, the three factions would no doubt end up attacking each other, and Lord Hyle couldn't see his brother, Daniel, die as a result. And so he made this deal, a very interesting deal, I found. And this was something that completely blindsided me. I didn't see it as an option. He basically said to Bethany, I want you out of Ely. I want you out of Ely, take the Cainite heresy with you, because even if you did rule, you'll be ruling from a gilded cage. You'll be underneath the cathedral, and for as long as you're under the cathedral, fair enough, you're safe from the Tremere, but you can't really do much. Everyone is out to get you. I want you out of Ely, and I want you down in Sarum, my homestead, in the valley beside the hill fort of Sarum. And you can build your own, there's already a village down there, you can turn it into a town, you can bring your cult down there, and you'll be under my protection. In the meantime, we will appoint Alice Upland as the Lord of Ely, because she has the most legitimate claim, and it will cause the least civil discontent. But it is on the basis that you leave. Now, of course, Bethany was fairly unhappy with this, because Ely is a safe haven for her. The true faith there drives the Tremere away, but he was correct. She was in a cage. It also meant she could never leave. Under Lord Hyle, a satrap's protection, that kind of implies it's under Mithras's protection as well. And she could see that being on the south coast, as Sarum pretty much is, would provide an even better landing point for other members of the Cainite heresy. It does have the proximity to Winchester, which is a Tremere bastion, which isn't good, but if Sarum could be shored up, and again under the protection of other more powerful vampires, she could do well out of it. And so after signing a scroll, both of them signed the scroll, both of them sealed it, and both of them sent it to London, that this would be the case, that Alice Upland would become Lord, that the Salubri would not just be ejected, evicted, or told to stay in your place, but given a new place to rule, potentially, that appeased her. And all that Hyle is left with now is the fallout from Daniel. If Daniel did truly care for lit rulership, he's not going to be very happy with his brother in La Sombre blood. But that will probably come about in the next session, because it ended pretty much with them sealing the scroll that said that Bethany would be granted lands outside Sarum, the prospective town of Salisbury, and Alice Upland would be Lord or Lady of Ely from henceforth. Now, there are various secrets that have been missed in this session. There have been various secrets missed indeed, and that's fine. If they stay missed, they stay missed. But I'm looking forward to seeing whether you can guess what has been going on, especially regarding Aetheldred, the Salubri, Aetheldred, Bethany, Alice, and the Lupines. What's going on there? What's going on with the crows that surround Alice Upland? Well, we'll have to see on the next session, but thank you very much for watching.